Great. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Good morning. I am Kelly Bourne, Executive Director of the Cyber Policy Center here at Stanford University. And we are glad to be today hosting a conversation about platform scale, and in particular, the challenges that the monopoly position of social media companies hold and pose for our global information ecosystems. And I'm glad to be joined today by a great group of discussants. We will have first Frank Fukuyama, who is the director of Stanford Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. He is a leader here at the Cyber Policy Center's program on democracy and the internet, director of the Stanford Masters in International Policy, and the leader of the Stanford Working Group on Platform Policy, which we are hearing from, on Platform Scale, which we are hearing from today. We'll also be joined by Ashish Goel, who is a professor of management, science, and engineering here at Stanford, and by courtesy of computer science, by Barak Richman, professor of law and business administration at Duke University, who focuses on antitrust amongst many other things, as well as by Roberta Katz and Maricha Shake. Roberta is from the Center for the Advanced Study in Behavioral Science. Maricha is a policy director of international policy here at the Cyber Policy Center, who they are both also members of the Stanford Working Group on Platform Scale and may have some remarks. And then from there, we will be turning it over to Luigi Zingales, who is a professor of finance at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business and a co-host of the podcast Capital Isn't. And then finally by Dick Costolo, who was the CEO of Twitter from 2010 to 2015, the founder and CEO of multiple startups, and now a managing partner at O1 Advisors, which works with startup CEOs. And there is perhaps no one in the world as qualified as Dick to reflect on the issues at hand. Quick, before turning it over to many of these panelists, for those who are not familiar with the Cyber Policy Center, all of our research and teaching focuses on improving the governance of digital technologies when it comes to questions of geopolitics, security, and democracy. We're home to about a half dozen programs, and all of our work is intended to inform the policy agendas for governments, tech companies, civil society, and academia when, again, it comes to these questions of how best to govern digital technologies. We host all of these webinars every other Wednesday at 10 a.m. PST. And for today's webinar, just for a bit of background, I think as many here know, in early October, Democratic members of the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust published a more than 400-page report, the result of 16 months of investigation, exploring whether the four biggest tech giants, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google, engage in a range of antitrust and anti-competitive behavior. Together with Microsoft, which has, of course, had its own antitrust challenges and battles in the past, these companies now represent more than 20% of US GDP. They have also joined the ranks of the top 10 lobbying groups in the United States, which of course further complicates their regulation. But there are many reasons, both economic and perhaps more importantly, social and democratic, that people are concerned about the tech companies' monopoly positions, and a whole range of solutions to address their impact on society and the information ecosystem have been proposed. Everything from improved content moderation to fact-checking, news and digital literacy trainings, amendments to CDA 230 and the liability that platforms face for what they host, and a whole lot more. Today's conversation is really going to focus on ways to make the platforms more competitive and many of the antitrust challenges that we've been talking about here. So I want to start, Frank, first and turn it over to you, and then have you turn it over to colleagues after that. We will save 20 or 30 minutes at the end for Q&A. As folks can go ahead and enter their questions in the chat box, I will go ahead and moderate that. There is a function that will allow you to upvote questions. So if there are questions that are of particular interest, please go ahead and upvote those, and we will get to them about 20 minutes to the hour. All right, thank you. And Frank, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Kelly. So let's put the slides up. So this is a report of the working group on platform scale here at Stanford. Next slide. We put the link to the actual working group paper in the chat box, and you should feel free to download it. It's part of the program on democracy and the internet that has been sponsored very supportively by the Knight Foundation. Next slide, please. So these are the members of our group. There's one political scientist, one former European parliamentarian, three lawyers with antitrust backgrounds. We actually, and a computer scientist. We also had a couple of economists that had to leave our group early, but made important contributions to the discussion. Next slide. So there's been a lot of work, as Kelly indicated, on antitrust in recent months. There's a number of academic centers, the Stigler Center that Luigi runs, the Berkman Center at Harvard, Thurman Arnold Project at Yale, and then various other initiatives, as well as all of the legislative and regulatory initiatives that have been undertaken, which you've been reading about from day to day in the newspapers. When we began this group, the title was actually the Stanford Antitrust Working Group. But as we began to discuss the issues underlying antitrust, we began to realize that antitrust is too narrow a framing of what the real issue was. It restricted us to a certain class of economic problems, but in fact, the issue was much larger than that. Next slide, please. I think that you can put the harms that people have pointed to of these large platforms into three categories. Antitrust law is really suited to dealing with economic harms like exclusionary policies, the use of monopoly power to stifle competition and innovation, and the like. There's a separate category of social harms that have a lot to do with the violations of privacy and the effects on social relationships that platform use involves. But in our group, we decided that we would focus on the political harms. There's a lot of work being done in terms of the narrowly defined economic harms that antitrust law deals with, and we didn't feel that, there are literally thousands of lawyers working full time on this issue as we speak, and our contributions in this area were going to be limited. But the political harms, I think, are the things that bother many stakeholders. And people have been talking since 2016 about things like filter bubbles, targeted advertising, fake news, conspiracy theories as deleterious to democracy. But I don't think they've been focused adequately on the question of scale, because that's really what is problematic, I think, in our world today. In our view, the current situation with the large platforms, Google, Facebook, and Twitter, is comparable to the situation that existed in the 50s and 60s with broadcast television, when there were only three major networks that heavily shaped political discourse in the United States. At that time, the government saw fit to regulate what the networks could carry through something called the Fairness Doctrine, which the Supreme Court at the time decided was constitutional and consistent with the First Amendment. But this was very controversial. It was rescinded by the FCC in 1987. And I think today it's inconceivable that in our polarized world we could have something like an agreed upon fairness doctrine. As a result, what's happened is that many civil society groups have pushed the platforms to self-regulate, to curate news as if they're media companies responsible for the quality of political discourse. We've seen this as we speak this week with Twitter labeling tweets of our president as disputed, factually disputed, when he talks about electoral fraud. And in our view, this kind of curation by the platforms, by these big private companies, is not a sustainable solution to the problem. We may like what Jack Dorsey is doing with regard to President Trump, but it's that underlying power that we regard as a kind of loaded weapon. It's like a gun that's sitting on the table, And we can't rely on the good intentions of the person sitting opposite us on the table to use that, to not use that gun on us, because in the future, it may be turned that way. If we could get the next slide. I think that we need to really be concerned with the things that are specific to large-scale platforms, and that is their power to amplify or to diminish certain political voices based on a business model that encourages clicks and virality, and in a process that is actually completely non-transparent. It's run by artificial intelligence algorithms that modify themselves, and the content that is served up to people is something that they don't really understand the logic behind. And I think for our democracy, it creates a lot of problems with regard to the ability to deliberate for basic social cohesion. It's contributed to polarization and all of the ills that many people have referred to. So with that, I'll turn it over to Barack.
Thanks, Frank, very much. I'll say at the outset that it's been a real honor to be part of this group. And it's also an honor to hear from Dick and Luigi on our work. So bearing in mind that I want to make sure they have enough time, I'll try to be very brief. So I think that our contribution could be summarized, you might say, in three distinct parts. Number one, in approaching trying to understand what kind of dangers the large platforms like Facebook and Google and Twitter and Amazon pose. Our first observation, our first contribution is that, as what Frank said, we recognize that the harms they pose are not just economic, but in fact, maybe their greatest harms are political in nature. The second contribution is that we didn't just want to look at antitrust harms. We also wanted to look at, rather antitrust remedies. We also wanted to look at a variety of other remedies, and that's what I'll talk about. And our third contribution is that the recommendation that we have is more of a technological one, and that's what Ashish will talk about. So next slide. I'm going to talk about four alternative options, only one of them being antitrust remedies. And we're going to describe why we felt that each of these remedies, some of which have been talked about more than others, don't really address the core political problems that Frank described, which, as we mentioned, are, we think, only underappreciated, perhaps the greatest dangers of all. So in examining how antitrust law could alleviate the political threats and the dominance that these platforms have over communication, we looked at the possible antitrust actions, and there are some viable actions. The platforms do have allegedly engaged in certain abuses of their dominance. They certainly have acquired and merged with nascent competitors, which might have enshrined their dominance. They have engaged in certain information acquisition practices that could be anti-competitive. And each of these categories of conduct might amount to a viable antitrust claim, and they all might be attractive things to pursue in the sense that they might limit certain economic harm, and maybe they even would limit the kind of expansive political dominance that the platforms have. But none of them really address the core political concerns. They might mitigate certain economic harms, but they would not really dilute the kind of political power that these platforms have. And in that sense, although we're enthusiastic about a lot of the antitrust work that's happening, we really do not think that relying on the Sherman Act alone would mitigate the core concerns we have. Next slide. So in response to that observation, and I don't think we're the only ones to say that traditional antitrust law might be limited in addressing these foundational concerns about dominance, some people have said, well, maybe that means we should just reform antitrust law. We should have antitrust law expand its concern, not just for consumer welfare, not just for economic concerns, but also to really address underlying concerns about political power. And there are some who associate themselves with what's called the neo-Brandeisian antitrust movement that have proposed this. It would perhaps allow even actions that might reduce consumer welfare. It might allow actions that will reduce political power and overall economic power that the platforms have. But we're really worried about reforming antitrust law in this light. We think that incorporating additional and incommensurate values into antitrust law would put courts and agencies in a really difficult spot. It would be very difficult to police good antitrust law. It would put agencies and judges in a position of allocating welfare, often in a negative-sum relationship. It would be very, very hard to curtail an expanded multi-valued antitrust law to do the kind of things that we really want antitrust law to do. So we're very skeptical of this option. No, go ahead, next slide. The third possibility that we've talked about and others have proposed is perhaps requiring the platforms to make their data sources available and interoperable with competing platforms, or alternatively allowing individual users to take their data from one platform to another. This would alleviate lock-in. It would be easier, for example, to instead of relying on everyone to be on Facebook, it might make it easier to move to an alternative platform, or it might allow an alternative platform to capitalize upon the data that these large platforms like Facebook have. We think this offers a lot of potential, but we think that the technological difficulties have really been underestimated. Each platform has different character, has different data structure. The plausibility of moving meaningful data, the metadata, the data that Facebook generates and Google generates in order to understand how to market, how to sell valuable advertising. It's not clear that that data would be movable. And we also are concerned that as a general matter, allowing data to be more portable and more interoperable raises other concerns. For example, if the data has greater accessibility to others, then that also threatens concerns surrounding privacy. I will say that our middleware proposal does build upon some idea that underlies the data interoperability suggestions, but we think as a general remedy, pursuing initiatives to require data portability or interoperability would be both infeasible and also problematic on other fronts. Next slide. Our last, the last of the options that I'll be talking about that we discussed and explored is enhancing privacy protections. And the basic idea behind this is that the source of the platform data, not just, the source of the platform's power, not just the economic power, but especially political power, really relies on gathering, amassing enormous amounts of personal data. And the possibility that if we limit the acquisition and use of this data, maybe we can limit their economic comparative advantage, and maybe it can mitigate a lot of the political dangers that we're concerned about. They would have less of an ability to control information flows and to exploit individual vulnerabilities from lack of privacy. And these remedies also are attractive. There's a lot of reasons to do it, both for economic and political concerns, or frankly, are reasons to enhance privacy protections for privacy's sake itself. But many of the incursions by the dominant platforms have already taken place. The dominant platforms already have enormous collections of personal data. And it would be very difficult to institute privacy protections that would limit the economic and political power they have already amassed. We also are concerned that instituting regulations that have certain privacy protocols might be a source of entry barriers as well, and might undesirably sustain the comparative advantage, the current dominance that the platforms have. So we think that this is attractive, but we don't, again, think that privacy protections would really get at the underlying source of political power and would not alleviate the kind of control that the current platforms have. So with those policy objectives, with those alternative remedies being explored, and are finding shortcomings with each of them, although there's a lot that's attractive in each as well, we arrived at a more technologically oriented solution, and that's the middleware. And I'll pass this over to Ashish.
Hi, so before we launch into our middleware approach, there's some points which I would like to make. Our goal was to come up with a technical solution which we think would actually address the problem. So it has to be big enough in scope to actually address the problem. But at the same time, we were also mindful that these solutions, where possible, should not disintermediate existing platforms or should not severely hinder their existing business model to the point that where we might risk disrupting the entire tech innovation ecosystem. And also, I would like to clarify that we don't think that middleware is the only solution. We believe that this would work in conjunction with other things. And these are very preliminary ideas and much hard work remains to be done. Next slide, please. So I'll start with a slide by Jack Dorsey. And you'll notice that even the tech platform leaders are in favor of enabling people to choose their own algorithms to rank the content, right? We're going to go one level further than this in our proposal. Jack says, to be that open, I think would be pretty incredible. We think it'll be nicer to be even more open. And again, that's something that we will outline in our talk going forward. So how does middleware work? An end user can choose among a variety of middleware providers, right? So I might choose ACLU, someone else might choose American Enterprise Institute. And these middleware providers will tag political content with labels such as misleading, needs additional context, etc. And then they'll send their tags directly to the platform. They can also provide ranking algorithms to be used by the tech platforms or relevance scores for specific pieces of content. And the platform then applies these filters and ranking algorithms to alter the results of any query made by the user. So what's really sitting in the middle, and the reason we use the term middleware, between the user and the platform, is not a piece of software, but rather the editorial judgment of the middleware provider. So you can think of middleware as an editorial middleware if you want. So this is what the relationship between a middleware and a platform looks like in what we're imagining. So imagine there being a wall, like think of it as a Chinese wall. And the user comes to a search or social platform, issues a query, maybe just wants to sort of browse on a web page. And there's a bunch of content being served by the platform. And some of this is content of a political nature. And for that content, the platform will use middleware provided filters and re-ranking criteria before it sends the results back to the user. And we're going to illustrate this using some examples. So for example, you can imagine on Facebook, this is how the user would choose a middleware. There would be a preference pane where the user can go and choose the middleware service that they want to use for fact checking, maybe for privacy. And I want to point out that while our primary focus here is on political content, in fact, we believe that middleware can also be used effectively for privacy by, for example, choosing a very detailed menu of privacy options on Facebook. So this would be like one component of our idea, that the user should choose their own middleware service provider, right? And they should be done in some kind of like an opt-out fashion where the platform cannot be its own default. Then we also have some examples of what this would look like to the end user when they're using the platform. So for example, here's a tweet, and if I've chosen ACLU as my middleware provider, then instead of saying this tweet is considered hate speech by Twitter, you'll see a tag saying this tweet is considered hate speech by the ACLU. This tweet has been carefully chosen to not be a hate speech tweet. So we didn't want to actually show an actual hate speech tweet. So I apologize to whoever made the tweet. This tweet is actually perfectly fine. So this is one instantiation of how middleware would impact what users see. Here's another instantiation. So for example, when you search for news results on Google, you could see results ranked upon the preferred news sources that the user has specified. And the user has specified these preferred news sources not by going and choosing each news source individually, because that would be very hard for the user, but by choosing a middleware provider, which is then serving these recommendations to the platform. You can also imagine someone in the medical profession choosing a middleware company that prioritizes healthcare related news. Okay? And so we have seen, for example, how a service like this this idea could apply to things like Twitter, to things like Google, to things like Facebook. And once again, while our focus has been on political content, In fact, we believe that this would also help expand user control over commercial content. So you can imagine, for example, a middleware provider to affect how search results on Amazon get ranked for commercial content. For example, they might want to prioritize products made in the United States. So some of the advantages of middleware is that really dilutes the control of dominant platforms. So instead of, so platforms still retain much of the core functionality, right? And there's no one coming between the platform and the user, but it really reduces the power of the platforms to control information. And in fact, in his testimony, Mark Zuckerberg mentioned that they don't actually want to have editorial control. And so if tech platforms don't want to have editorial control, then they should be willing to cede this editorial control to a third-party middleware, right? It also reduces ability of third parties to manipulate content disseminated on the platforms. So for example, one of the things that Frank alluded to at the beginning was that one big harm that's being caused is not just because these platforms are behaving in some with intention in some way, but third parties are trying to manipulate what content people see. And the fact that tech companies actually maximize clicks as opposed to utility leads to a lot of the manipulations. And so by having a middleware provider which is not trying to maximize clicks, this will reduce the ability of third parties to manipulate content. The additional benefits, but in the interest of time, I feel like instead of just harping on the benefits, we should also focus on some of the challenges and the work ahead, and Barak will take over.
Terrific, Ashish. So, yeah, as Ashish mentioned, this is an idea that really is very preliminary. There's a lot more that thinking needs to be done. And what we did in our report, after describing what we think middleware could really do, we then started listing what the next set of decisions would be. And we had identified three in particular. Number one is Ashish identified the kind of interplay that middleware and the platforms would have with each other. And a lot of that probably needs to be spelled out more. To some degree, there certainly needs to be certain requirements to make sure that middleware really does give users meaningful decisions. The responsibility between the platforms and the middleware could vary, and could vary based on what the user wants. But that power balance really has to be worked out. And also, we think that there are certain minimal regulator would have to impose on middleware products. So these are things from the regulatory, and you might even say from the statutory perspective, that still need to be worked out. We also need to make sure, think more about how to make middleware an attractive financial model we have to make sure that middleware providers are financially incentivized to offer middleware products. And it's possible that middleware will help identify individuals for whom advertisers would want to target, and maybe the addition of a middleware layer would create additional revenue that the middleware provider and the platform could share. But alternatively, middleware providers could use user fees or sell advertising directly. This is something also that would need to be worked out, because it's really critical to have this technological solution be sustainable and encouraged by market opportunities. And finally, there are a lot of technical issues that really need to be worked out. The middleware needs to express different kinds of platform content and needs to accommodate to different technical architectures. So there will have to be a lot of coordination, a lot of work together that middleware providers and platforms will have to work out. So this is our last slide. In conclusion, we think we are identifying a different category of harms from others, and this is a category of political harms we think really need a lot more attention. And we also consider multiple approaches. We are not focused only on traditional antitrust concerns, and we're also not focused on traditional antitrust remedies. We are looking at all sorts of a variety of other regulatory remedies. And ultimately, the main proposal we have is a technological one, middleware. We take editorial power away from a small number of technological platforms and hand it over not only to a competitive market, but also a competitive market that's responsive to users' preferences. And we think that this will really address not only demands that users have, but also will address the core problem of political dominance that has driven our analysis.
Great, thank you all so much. So with that, we are getting some great questions. Please keep them coming. But before turning to those, would love Luigi to turn to you for comments and responses here, and then Dick, over to you.
Okay, can you hear me? So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to comment on this phenomenal contribution. And I have to say, I'm not the best discussant because I agree with not only the approach, but much of the conclusion that this report is proposing. So I'm not the most critical discussant that you can have. What is funny is that both Francis and I come from very different backgrounds, and we arrived to a very similar conclusion. And I think that sometimes I love the expression by former Prime Minister Clemenceau that paraphrasing his famous sentence, antitrust is too serious a matter to let it run by antitrust experts. I think that the problem is too big, and very often people that are within the field, and I'm certainly not within the field, look only at the tree and not the forest. And the beautiful thing about this report is that it really looks at the forest. And I think that the forest is that the problem is in the business model of the digital platform. So hate speech, biases, diffusion of information that is fake, etc., is not a bug of the system, is a feature of the system. There is a strong incentive for all these platforms to push the most titillating, incredible information in order to get attention, in order to get people to spend time on it, in order to get more visibility, more data, more profits. So the proposal that they make is very clever and is trying to say, let's create a technological intermediary that will solve all the problems. I like the idea because I share this group diffidence with any intervention in terms of regulation of freedom of speech or giving power to censorship to the platform. I think that the discussion that the fairness doctrine was possible in a country in the 1970s when there was more homogeneity of views. Today, the world is so polarized that it's impossible to maintain. So I'm very sympathetic to this. Now, of course, I have some questions. First of all, much of the report focuses on Facebook and Twitter, but I am also very concerned, nobody wants to talk about this, but I'm also very concerned about Google. And why? Is because there is research, nobody wants to cite this research, I don't know why, but there is research that suggests that simply ranking news in different ways induces people to vote in a different way. And we're not even saying faking news, it's just ranking them differently. So if I put Hunter Biden first, people are going to vote for Trump. And if I put Stormy Daniels first, people are going to vote for Biden. I'm exaggerating. This is not the experiment, just you get a sense. And how do you fix this problem? I think that that's more difficult. I thought about, and maybe this is the idea of the middleware, I thought about a kind of unbundling of the last mile. This shows my background. I spent some time in telecommunications. So facing a natural monopoly. So for example, in Italy, there is only one fixed line that goes to every house. And so that's at the moment a natural monopoly. To create competition, what they did is they unbundled the last mile, so forcing the monopolist provider to provide the last mile at a competitive price to a number of potential providers. And the analogy here with Google is maybe what we should do is there is an enormous natural monopoly in search because there are returns to scale, and these returns to scales are emphasized the more people search. So from an efficiency point of view, we don't want to break this apart. However, after the search is done, how you present this search to your customers, whether you put 10 top ads first or not, whether you rank first certain news or not, that could be done by a middleware at the bottom. Of course, you need to force Google to share the search result at a predetermined price to the various providers. And this is the part that I have not seen very clearly in the report, but I think is the crucial part, is what kind of regulation we need to get this middleware solution implementable. Because let me tell you that at least in social media, a middleware company did exist. It was called Power Ventures, and what was doing was reaching all the social media that we're using and getting data from there, presenting to the final user in the way they wanted, and then when they wanted to post their pictures, they posted the picture on Power Venture, and Power Venture automatically would post it on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, whatever you want. Now, that company is no more. Why? Because Facebook sued the hell out of them. And sued the hell out of them, establishing the following principle. I'm not a lawyer, but as a citizen, I find this outrageous, that if I give Kelly my login and password for my Facebook account, and she, with my authorization, enters into my Facebook account with my login and my password and gets some data, she commits hacking, which is a federal crime. She can go to jail. Okay? So under this world, I think will be inconceivable that any middleware company were to operate. So we need to think about how we go about undoing the effect. This is now, I think, a district level judge opinion, so it does not have the power of the Supreme Court decision, but the Supreme Court rejected to look at it. So I think it's very difficult to overturn. We will need to have some massive political movement to do it. And then the question is, for you, Francis, given you are the political scientist in the group, where do we get the political will to do that? One of the interesting facts of the Steele report was saying that the problem with regulating the digital platforms is that they're also very politically influential. And so I think the challenge is how to pass some serious regulation at the time where the political demand is not there.
Thank you, Luigi. Some great points, and we have a number of great questions coming up too. But first, Dick, I'm really curious to hear your reactions to this proposal.
Sure. As Ashish knows from working with me, I'm a callous pragmatist. So I'll try to start off with my positive idealistic views and then revert to the norm of my callous pragmatism toward the end. So first of all, and to the point that was just made, Mark and Jack and others are telling the truth when they announce that they don't want the responsibility for editorial control. It's tremendously painful. It causes all sorts of drama internally, and it's only getting harder and more challenging. And I can tell you from being on the other side of the fence that the examples you hear about on a day-to-day basis in the news are a fraction of the kinds of editorial decisions that these companies have to make on an ongoing basis over abuse and trolling. And and if we make this decision, I guess that means we're suspending the New York Post's account. Is that something we want to be having a conversation about every day? They don't want to be doing that. They've been forced to do this. So I do think that there is an opportunity by providing them with the sort of the gift of not having to be in that business anymore, of giving them this sort of a gift of a third party of middleware, that I think they would embrace the idea behind that. And again, idealistically, the elegance of this solution is that it's kind of like, it reminded me of George Mitchell being the ombudsman for the Irish peace process. There you had somebody who was a trusted third party, trusted by everybody around the table, all sides, and all sides believed that he would do what was in everybody's best interest, not in one side's best interest. So to the extent you could have trusted third parties that were these middleware providers, and not just trusted by, again, if the one side of the Irish peace talks had brought someone they liked but not the other side, would have never gotten anywhere. And I do think one of the points you made, middleware providers would need to satisfy minimal journalistic requirements, is precisely one of the problems, right? Look at Facebook and Twitter and who they consider to be high authority, verified journalists, and who they don't. You end up with these, gray areas around One American News Network and InfoWars, and some people saying why they should be allowed in, and other people saying there's no way. And my worry would be that you end up with these middleware providers who just exacerbate the existing problems, and you've got some alt-right middleware provider that's reinforcing what people in alt-right circles already believe, and vice versa on the other side. So to the extent you could figure out some way to have some journalistic third party verify these middleware providers, that would be great. And I think that would be then fantastic. And you would have to pick from this maybe limited selection of middleware providers. I think that would be elegant and a great way to go about it, and not exacerbate the problem. I also think that it's a mistake not to layer in privacy into those middleware providers. People have so little understanding of how their data is used and shared across these platforms. And there are companies out there that understand that and want to help people understand it, but there's no great business model for it. So to the extent you could couple the business model for this sort of middleware in providing people with a more nuanced and all sides feed with privacy middleware that could sort of piggyback off the business models that you all noted for a middleware provider, I think that would be great. It would be just wonderful to understand when you buy something from a website and I bought something from a website and shipped it to my daughter at her home address. Every time she goes on Instagram now, she sees ads for this website. She's like, I never shopped there before. You just shipped me something from here. So it'd be great to know when you go to one of these sites, hey, just so you know, this address you're shipping to is going to be coupled with and cross-checked against all sorts of social media accounts and given or sold to those providers. That would be just a world-class helpful to people everywhere if you could bundle those two things together. So those are my overall thoughts, and I could talk about this stuff for 5 hours, but happy to answer questions.
Great. Thank you, Dick, and thanks everyone here. We have a great set of questions here. I want to invite anyone else who wants to pose a question to go ahead and do so. Maricha and Roberta also, if you have any comments, I'll turn to you in a moment. If you'd like to do so, just raise your hand. Otherwise, you can go ahead and respond to some of the many questions that have come in. I want to start so that I have sort of bucketed questions in 4 categories. The most common have been around the impact that this is likely to have on the particular problem of polarization. And Frank, I know you and I have talked about this in other webinars in the past. My understanding, if I am capturing your views correctly, is that we have 2 problems here. One, of people on the extremes becoming more and more extreme, and this wouldn't necessarily solve that problem. But we have a larger problem of the entire moderate population in the world being pulled out to the extremes by virtue of the fact that they are sort of caught in the crossfire of a lot of disinformation on these platforms. So this would solve one problem, but not perhaps both. Let me ask, before turning to the 3 other categories of questions, does that more or less sum up your views on how this would impact political polarization?
Yes. So I don't think that we can get rid of polarization by any of these policy interventions. We have basic freedom of speech, and so if you want to believe in QAnon, you've got a right to do that. And I think that there's no technological way to stamp this stuff out. If you just look at QAnon itself, it starts on 4chan, it goes to 8kun, and then you could do it on Signal or Telegram or an encrypted channel. And so it's going to be there, I think, regardless. What you don't want is amplification or suppression on a mass scale. And again, this gets back to the issue of scale itself, because it is these large platforms that have the ability to push this stuff out into a broader audience that then can affect, much larger parts of the voting population. So I think that's the central issue. But we're not going to get rid of, crazy people saying crazy things on the internet, because at this point, it's simply not possible.
Do you remember the good old days when political scientists were clamoring for more polarization and distinction in the voting population? So yeah, here we are. Okay, so we have a little more than 10 minutes left. I'd love to turn to a lightning round of responses, keeping them at a minute or under from everyone here. We have questions that fall into, I would say, 3 categories that roughly map all of the different stakeholders who would have to some way engage in this process in order to make it work. We have first questions about users. How would they find this technology? Would they actually adopt it? Inserting my own views here, but where you have only about 50% of the population that turns out to vote in a given presidential election, how much of the burden can we put on users to adopt this new technology? And would they really eat their broccoli and choose necessarily more moderate platforms, or might they choose to, or might the evidence of the success of some of the current social media platforms suggest that people maybe like some of this more engaging and potentially polarizing content? So there's a whole set of questions on users, but in the interest of time, let me tee up a couple of the others, and then you can sort of answer those. You can choose which ones you want to answer. So we have questions about users. We have questions about the providers themselves, the Disneys and ACLUs and American Enterprise Institutes, and having both the technological capacity and the monetary incentives to develop these kinds of middleware technologies, given that it would presumably require quite a lot of them to do so. And then we have a third question, a set of questions about the platforms themselves. Dick, you spoke to the willingness of them, the potential willingness or incentives for them to do this, which I had not necessarily anticipated. I think there have been some questions about whether they would be willing to do so, given how that might impact their revenue models. And then some questions about whether the platforms themselves would be allowed to enter these markets or would be prohibited from doing so, or whether they might try in some way to manipulate service providers. So I know those are quite a few to tee up there. Do we want to maybe start with users? Would they adopt it? How would they find these? Would they necessarily eat their broccoli? Any thoughts on that? Roberta, I thought you, coming from CASBUS, might.
Yeah, I have just a couple of comments. One is a general one. If you look at our report, we have said clearly that this middleware solution, as Ashish said, needs a lot more thought. And the other thing we've said that might not have shown up in the slides is that it will have to be paired with some regulatory agencies' involvement. So this will get rolled out, assuming this is a successful way to go. It will get rolled out in a big way. The other thing I want to mention in terms of users is that as someone who's just completed a study on Gen Z, the familiarity of younger citizens with all things digital is going to solve some of this worry about will users take the initiative to choose one or more middleware providers. So I just want to add that perspective.
Great, thank you. Other thoughts on users, or we can turn to questions about providers, but other responses here?
I think that if you don't, Ashish mentioned it being an opt-out as opposed to an opt-in, you'll just find that people stick with the defaults in their preferences far more often than you might think they would. So to the extent you put one in there to begin with and they have to go in and change it or remove it, it's far more likely to see take up than it is if you make them go select one even if you remind them to go select one. They won't change generally speaking, they don't change the default preferences.
I think that's a great point. I consider myself to be slightly more tech savvy than the average person, and still seldom do I go back into that back end. Okay, so
sorry, actually, this point is fantastic, because then we have a way to resolve polarization. We give as a default the opposite of their political views. So if you are a Republican, we give you a Democrat and vice versa, and either you learn to change the default or you learn to increase your views. Problem solved.
I think the data on that actually suggests that if you take real extremists and confront them with polarized information, they get more pissed off and sort of grind their heels in. But if you had PBS as the default, that might maybe that would get us there. Okay, providers. Would people enter this space? Would they have there was a comment around, would the ACLU have the technical capacity to do this? Would they have the financial incentives to do this? I recall in your paper you suggest that potentially the platforms be somehow required or incentivized to share profits with these providers, these middleware providers. At a certain point, if you have quite a lot of them, how does this affect different competitors' sort of profit incentives? So how do you think that market of providers might evolve?
So I think taking the first part of the question, which is whether companies like ACLU would have the technical ability to provide this service. And this is where I think Dick's comment about platforms embracing it would be super useful. So it doesn't, there's a whole variety of ways in which you can imagine this happening. You can imagine ACLU tagging important tweets and important news items on an individual basis. But you can also imagine a company like Google taking part of its deep learning pipeline and just removing the last layer and letting a company like ACLU provide input into how the last layer of learning is going to work, which would allow essentially ACLU to be in a transparent way, provide input to the machine learning algorithms that Google uses. And again, the technical complexity of this is going to be sufficient that this is not going to happen without active support from platforms and like an active embrace of this idea. And to refer back to an earlier question about there's a difference. So what Dick is suggesting is that platforms might actually embrace an idea of this type, but the idea that Dick is suggesting they might embrace is where third parties are providing editorial control, not the one where this third party just sits on top of the platform and the entire view of the platform is then gated by this third party. That's called disintermediation. And unless I'm incorrect, and Dick will correct me if I'm wrong, platforms will fight that to the death.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and in fact, if you could go to the platforms and say, make you a deal. We'll take care of all the editorial decision making so you don't get called in front of Congress about why you tagged this one and why not that one, and you don't get accused of preventing abuse here but not over there. We'll take care of all of that, and we can also in exchange promise that overall engagement is not going to change plus or minus 0.x%. If you could tell them that, they would say yes all day. The challenge is going to be, what are these editorial filters that in a resultant feed going to do to my engagement? And we won't know until we run those different tests.
No, but this is the essence of the problem, is the business model wants to have editorial control. The moment we put an intermediary that filters editorial control, the digital platform will go banana. Now, might be the right thing to do, but they're going to fight tooth and nail because that's the end of their business model. But if we don't fix the business model, we don't fix the problem.
Yeah, I disagree. I think to what Ashish is saying is, if you could have told me when I was CEO of Twitter, I'll take all these editorial decisions, of what to flag and what to tag and what not to tag off your hands. But look, the user engagement is going to remain the same because of I'm not going to sit over you and change everything the user sees. Just as the way she's described, people would love that. They don't want to be in the business of getting hauled in front of Congress every week for why they tagged this tweet and not that tweet. It's only going to result in more and more trauma for them.
No, I understand, but maybe I misunderstand the middleware. But if the issue is just that I have an AI tag of the news, I don't think that solves the problem. We need a filter of news. And I'm very happy to get AI filter my news or somebody else filter my news. But Twitter is not.
I think a really interesting point that you just brought up, Dick, that somewhat changed my mind. I had presumed that this would actually have to reduce the platform's economic positions just by virtue of other needing to finance these other middleware providers. But you could imagine a scenario where people are getting exactly the news that they want and ergo actually engage even more than they currently are because they're not quite as turned off by getting hit with all kinds of content that they find unappealing, which is actually, it had not occurred to me before. I think it's an interesting.
You could of course run those tests on different filters, obviously.
Right.
And really, also to craft sort of, just very quickly to craft sort of a middle position between the two. It's conceivable that platforms might not be happy if they're losing a bigger fraction of their revenue, say 5%. And I think that's where sort of they might need this idea of this utopia where there's a technical solution which solves all problems, everyone embraces it wholeheartedly, might break down and regulatory impetus might be needed. And I think this is related to what Dick was mentioning as him being a callous pragmatist.
Great. Well, we have 2 minutes left. I had come in, I must confess, somewhat skeptical, and I'm coming out actually somewhat persuaded that this could work, which I had not foreseen. So it has been really interesting here. I want to offer a last round of comments to everyone here in the last couple of minutes, and then we will turn over to just some next steps and upcoming events here at the center. But final thoughts from any and all?
Kelly, if I could say something, as Roberta was saying, this really requires further thinking through. We need to go to some entrepreneurs with this idea and say, what would it take for you to actually invest in creating a company like this? It was our feeling that you couldn't do this all voluntarily. There would have to be, some kind of a regulatory framework. I'm not sure meeting minimum journalistic standards is necessarily part of that, because you could get alt-right middleware providers as well. I think that's that would be fine. But the main thing is to give users control. But we don't know, and until we've actually done a lot more work in putting this idea out, I don't think we're going to have the answer. But I do think the government is going to have to set up the incentive structure, to make the platforms open their APIs so that some version of middleware would work. Just as long as I got the floor, I really want to thank the members of our working group. We've been meeting regularly, and we've been supported by people like Haifa and Avalon and other staff at the Cyber Policy Center. People have put a lot of work into this over the last 11 months, and I really hope that you enjoy the fruits of all of this labor, because it really was a group effort that we could not have done had we not been able to to work together in this fashion.
Thank you for mentioning that. I know how many folks have been involved here. There's also been a couple of requests to post the paper itself, and I can't recall if the Foreign Affairs article, I know you have something forthcoming on that also, but if you guys could please post a link, or Michelle, perhaps you can, if others don't have it handy, into the chat box for panelists so everyone can access this. We are now at the hour. Any last burning and insightful comments from folks before we turn to next steps? All right. Oh, Barack, please go ahead.
I just want to say that I love the exchange between Dick and Luigi, and it illustrates exactly what needs to be moving forward. I do think that our proposal needs some kind of buy-in from the platforms. It would not work if the platforms fight it tooth and nail, but at the same time, I think Luigi is exactly right. This can't be just as convenient for platforms. There really does need to be a change in how they influence political discourse. And ultimately, some kind of compromise is going to be necessary, where not categorical changes will be possible, but substantial changes will be necessary.
Barack, thank you. And thanks everyone here. This has been a fascinating conversation. So really appreciate everyone taking the time. We will be posting this webinar on our website in the next couple of days, and we'll also make sure that we add the links to the report there. In the meantime, wanted to turn quickly to some next steps. We have a number of upcoming webinars. On December 2nd, we will have a conversation with Sam Weinberg and others here at Stanford about challenges to digital literacy education in schools. On the 10th, we will have a half-day event from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. with a whole range of scholars and representatives from other organizations talking about the presidential election and what we have learned. On the 13th of January, colleagues from Common Sense and others will join us to discuss the new book, Which Side of History? Analyzing the impact of the platforms and potential interventions. And then on the 27th, Maricha Shake, our colleague here, will talk about the Digital Services Act and the implications that is going to have once passed in Europe. So hope folks can join us then and really appreciated today's conversation. So thank you everyone very much, and take care and happy holidays.